Well, thank you for hosting me tonight. It is really an honor and privilege to be with you. And one thing that I want to make sure you understand is that I serve you as your fur-bearer biologist. So in Pennsylvania, wildlife belongs to the people. And in North America, that's how it works. And so it's important for all of us to understand that it doesn't belong to any agency. We're just here to help manage it for you. And so it's important to have your voice heard if you have concerns. And we can talk more about that later. But today I want to talk about probably one of the most mysterious animals in our Commonwealth, and really one of the newer additions to Pennsylvania when it comes to wildlife. We're going to talk about some of the myths, misinformation that we hear about the coyote, and we're going to try to get to the facts so that you can help others understand where we're coming from and where this important animal is coming from as well. So in order to get started, we're going to start with a story. And this is an ancient story, and it's not my story. In fact, this story starts long before humans even walked on the planet. It starts when there was only animals, and these animals could talk to each other. In fact, they were fairly friendly. And we start with our main character, Coyote. And Coyote is walking across the desert, and he's looking for his friends. He's walking through grasslands, marshlands, and he can't find anybody. He can't find otter or beaver, elk or bear. And so he continues to walk and walk and walk until he gets exhausted and he cries out. Don't scare anybody. No one answers. So finally, he sits down in the prairie, only to hear something screaming underneath him, muffled. So he jumps up, and here is one of his friends, Meadowlark. And she says, "Coyote, you've broken my leg." And he said, "Meadowlark, I am sorry. I will heal your leg, but you need to tell me what has happened to all of our friends." So he takes some sticks, some grass, binds her leg, and she says, "I have terrible news for you. All of our friends have been swallowed up by a huge monster that has come in, and now it has gone into the mountains and is sleeping." So Coyote strikes off to find his friends and see if he can save them. He runs into the mountains, and soon he sees a ridge that looks very different than any of the other ridges. He walks up and finds it's the monster, the size of a mountain, sleeping. He finds its head, he walks up to its head, and he wakes it up, and he says, "Monster, let go of my friends." And Monster looks at him warily because he knows the coyote is a trickster, and he closes his eyes and goes back to sleep. So Coyote leaves and tries to come up with another plan on how he can get his friends out. So he thinks and thinks, and he comes back and he says, "Monster," he's crying, and he says, "I would rather die with my friends than live without them." So Monster opens its mouth, and he runs in and he tumbles down its throat. He closes its mouth. And as he falls into its stomach, he lights a small fire. And with this fire, he can see all of his friends are still there and they're still alive. So he tells his friends, "Make this fire burn brighter. I will sever the heart of this monster." So he begins to use his sharp teeth and cut the heartstrings of the monster. The monster wakes up to see smoke coming out of its nose, but it's too late. He has already cut the heart. The monster dies, its mouth falls open, and all of the animals run out and run back to their homes. Coyote walks out with the heart, and the only animal left with him is Fox. Coyote begins to cut the heart into pieces, and he takes it and he throws it across the landscape, across the mountains, into the prairies, into the desert. And everywhere a piece of this heart lands, an indigenous people group pops up. So he gets rid of all of the heart, and Fox says, "Well, Coyote, You did a good thing, but you did not leave a piece of heart for where you killed the monster. So Coyote took water, washed his paws. The blood fell from his paws into the ground, and this sprouted up the Nez Perce. And this is one of their creation stories. And this is important because we understand that the coyote was critical to many indigenous cultures throughout what is now North America. But again, we talk about the mysteriousness of this animal. And what do we know about coyotes? This is that coyote that pops up most often in our minds when we hear the word coyote. Now, if anybody was in the crowd that is like less than 20, they have no idea who this is. So then I have to explain it, but I feel like most of us are pretty well aware of who this is. A scrawny little desert living coyote, always trying to get a meal and always failing despite having the newest technology from Acme. But isn't this also what we hear about coyotes? This vicious, dangerous animal killing everything in its path, and even very dangerous to humans. And we also hear some other rumors. How did coyotes get here? The one I hear the most often, we brought it here. And we're still bringing it in by the truckloads. We hear that all the time. But we also hear about predation, and we also hear about hybridization. So coy dogs, or coyotes hybridizing with dogs, or hybridizing with wolves. And so these are the things that we're going to talk about this evening. But first, let's just talk about what is a coyote. And so it is a part of the Canidae family, the dog family. And in Pennsylvania, we have several native canid species, one that has been extirpated, the gray wolf, but we also have the red fox and the gray fox. And it's important to look at the difference between these species. The coyote measures about 60 inches in length, has about a 16-inch long tail that generally hangs down along its back legs. On average, weighs around 33 to 34 pounds, even though we often hear it's much, much bigger. And some are much bigger, and we'll learn why that's the case. And so we can see the difference. They have this long, pointy nose. They stand relatively tall, especially in comparison to our foxes. Our gray fox is the only canid that can actually climb trees. And that's an advantage when we talk about competition, because these species do compete with each other for the same food sources. There's very much a difference between coyotes in winter and coyotes in summer. And we heard about one experience, and what that reminded that person of was a German Shepherd. And that is exactly the first thing I thought when I saw the first coyote in the summertime. So we see they have a summer coat and a winter coat, much like many of our family pets when they shed out. And so it's important just to kind of get an idea for what a coyote is. Now, to add some more potential technical glitches, thanks to my PowerPoint, I'm going to try to play some coyote calls. And most of us have heard coyote calls, but if we haven't, it's important to understand what they sound like. So I'll try to make sure this isn't too loud. Make sure I can get it. So how does that make you feel? So for some folks, it doesn't really make you feel anything. But as a good example, this morning, every morning I get up at 4 and go for a hike at 4:30. I go up to the nearest mountain, hike up and over the mountain, just to try and stay in some semblance of shape. And this morning, as I went down the other side of the mountain, I heard a howl, which stopped me in my tracks. Because there's something inside of us as human beings that when we hear that, most people, it at least makes the hair come up on the back of our neck. And it's likely because wolves were a big part of our life at one time and trying to survive some of these larger predators. And coyotes still give us sometimes the heebie-jeebies when we hear them, especially when we don't expect it, and especially when they're really close. So it was a good example this morning. I heard this howl, and then I heard another howl, and in the distance, I could hear a train. And that's what was getting them to howl. This train was coming up through the valley, and they started to howl, and then you could hear that yipping and calling and barking. What's interesting is when we hear that, we often think, well, there's 6, 10, 12, there's a whole slew of them. In reality, there's generally only 2, 3, or 4 coyotes there at most. And we'll talk a little bit more about family groups and the size of some of these groups of coyotes in Pennsylvania. But let's first talk about coyote tracks. So just like all other species of wildlife, they leave sign. What we see here is actually a coyote track on the right and a dog track on the left. Dog tracks are usually much wider or rounder. And what helps tip us off is if it's a domestic dog, we see those toenails are clipped so that you see that straight versus a coyote, which is more of an oval shaped track with very sharp toenails. And those toenails kind of give it more of that oval size. So this is good in the wintertime, in the spring, when you're seeing tracks to kind of help differentiate. And then there's scat. This is the second thing that we see most often. We see this any time of the year. Coyote scat can range from anywhere from a few inches to 8 or 9 inches in length. A lot of times it's usually the thickness of your thumb or even thicker than that. But what do we find in coyote scat most often? We find hair, we find bone fragments, we find seeds, and this speaks to their diet, which we're going to talk more about, and how diverse that diet is, and how their diet changes throughout the year with what's available. This is a true omnivore, and it takes advantage of whatever it can find. So keep an eye out when you're out moving around, out on the trail, to see if you can find coyote scat. So let's talk a little bit about coyote range, and this helps answer that question, where did they come from and why are they the most recent mammal colonizing Pennsylvania? So when we look at up to the year 1900, we can see in this orange area, this is where coyotes historically were always at pre-European settlement. So we see them in the Great Plains, we see them down into the desert, as far down into Mexico and up into Canada. But look what happens up through present day. We see this huge range expansion in yellow down into Central America, from coast to coast in the US, and even further north, even up to Alaska in Canada, and some of the northern climes in the northeast of Canada as well. So how did this happen? We opened the door for coyotes to expand. They had one primary predator. Can anybody imagine what it would be? The gray wolf. And the gray wolf is very good at keeping coyote populations in check. And we've seen that as a great example in Yellowstone. By bringing back gray wolves, we see the coyote population decline rapidly, and we see a lot less, and we see them very much in fear of gray wolves. So the first thing we did as an agrarian society of Europeans coming in to North America was kill as many predators as we possibly could to protect our livestock. So the gray wolf went, the mountain lion went, bobcats nearly went and were nearly extirpated in Pennsylvania. Fishers were extirpated, and even things like river otters and some other species took it really on the chin. And so we removed their predators, but we also transformed the landscape by removing almost every tree in Pennsylvania, which is just amazing when you look out the window and you see woodlots and forests or mountains have been recovered with trees, but at one time it would have been a moonscape across Pennsylvania. And so what that did, as we moved westward, clearing trees, turning it into agriculture, we opened the door for a very similar habitat type to what coyotes had, and no predators to keep them in check. And so that as we moved west, coyotes moved east. And in Pennsylvania, most coyotes started to come in the late 1930s, early 1940s. And we'll talk a little bit about their range expansion here when we talk about the eastern coyote. So when I start to say eastern coyote, we are starting to talk about a slightly different animal, the animal that we're now used to seeing here in Pennsylvania. So the animal we saw in that orange was the western coyote. That was a much smaller animal. That average weight was really down in the low 30s, high 20s. But what we see is as we open the door and we see range expansion to the east, we see western coyotes moving into Pennsylvania across Indiana and Ohio. But then we see western coyotes going north into the Great Lakes states and up into Canada, where there are still remnant wolf populations. And what's interesting is we see something that really we never saw before. They start to interbreed with wolves. And as they do that, we see several things that are much different about them. Their size increases. In Pennsylvania, we see harvests of coyotes upwards of 60 pounds. They're much larger, and we start to see a lot of different color phases, which we don't see in western coyotes. So all of a sudden we have black coyotes, we have white coyotes, red coyotes, gray, black and white. And this is really part of those wolf genetics that we see shining through with these larger eastern coyotes. And so what happens is those eastern coyotes are coming in from Canada through New York into Pennsylvania. Western coyotes are coming in from the west. And of course, they begin to interbreed. And that eastern coyote, being much larger, wins out. So really what we have in Pennsylvania now, even though we were originally the contact zone, is mainly just eastern coyotes, this larger subspecies that also has a variety of different colors. Now, this is a great example. We just got this last winter, and I'm super excited to kind of share it with folks. And it's a good example of how coyotes are able to move such far distances. So we got a call from Ontario's Ministry of Fish and Wildlife. This was January of this, well, it was this year in January. And they said, we have a project where we're tracking coyotes. It's a research project here on the Long Point National Wildlife Refuge. Now that's about 25 miles straight line distance from Presque Isle, if you've been up to Presque Isle before. And what happens is they have one of their coyotes dead of winter when this lake is frozen. And as you remember, we actually got a real winter last year, even down here in the southeast. This coyote strikes out, starts heading west, and then drops south into the Ohio waters of Lake Erie. For some reason, it turns east, starts into Pennsylvania waters, and it skirts around Presque Isle. It doesn't come on to land, and then it attempts to come on to land to the east of Presque Isle, and then all of a sudden it disappears. So they asked us if we could go out with our receivers and see if we could pick this one up, and we never could. So what we think might have happened is it either fell through the ice or there was some open pockets of ice, which happens because of spring streams that come out, spring seeps underneath the ice, or it may have been harvested and we just lost contact with that transmitter. But overall, it ended up walking over 60 miles on the ice in a matter of about 2.5 days. And there's no food out there. And so this is really telling as to how coyotes are so successful in colonizing new areas, because they're just tough and they're able to travel very long distances. So let's talk a little bit about diet. What's interesting is when we look at diet studies here in Pennsylvania and abroad, the number one item is the white-tailed deer, but it's not what you think. It's not necessarily that they're killing deer. Now, we've done two different fawn predator studies in Pennsylvania to see what is eating our fawn. And guess who came in number 2 one year and number 3 the next year? It was the coyote. Can anybody guess what the first 1 or 2 was? The first one hasn't changed. So stuff that's actually killing and eating them. But yeah, no, not dogs. Cars is a good guess. Not humans. Yeah, black bears. Black bears and bobcats. So those are our top 3 predators of fawns. So we're talking about summertime when they're dropping fawns. But what's interesting is those predators aren't actually making a dent in our deer population, which probably doesn't surprise you down here in the Southeast where there's lots of deer. So we see that coyotes are eating deer throughout the year, but they're primarily eating dead deer. And that's because of how are deer dying throughout the year? You ladies had it right the first time. Cars, yes. So we have a crazy amount of deer road kills throughout the year. We also, during hunting season, we have deer that are shot and lost. We have deer that are shot, harvested, and then some of the remains might be on the landscape. And then, of course, we have lots of disease in deer, just like all of our other wildlife species. So there's deer dying on the landscape year round. And coyotes are taking advantage of it. We're going to learn why they're such an important scavenger. But what comes in number 2 is rodents. So rodents make up the backbone of almost all of our predators in Pennsylvania as far as their diet goes. It's what's most available throughout all of the year, and they take great advantage of it because there's a lot out there. We also see things like groundhogs and rabbits, a variety of different bird species. But remember, it's an omnivore. It has specialized dentition that allows it to rip meat, has molars in the back to grind food. And so we see it eating a lot of mass, both soft mass like raspberries, fruits, and hard mass like acorns and things like that. We see it eating a lot of insects different times of the year and a lot of vegetation. So we'll see a lot of grass and leaves and different things like that is coming up in these diet studies. And we also see them getting themselves into trouble by eating produce. So oftentimes if you have pumpkins, melons, things like that, and they're left unguarded, coyotes can be some of the number 1 predators to come in and actually carry those off and eat them. So they take advantage of as much as is available and whatever is most available. But let's walk through a year with the coyotes to get a better understanding of their overall ecology and biology. And we'll start in wintertime. This is most oftentimes the most difficult time for coyotes, but it's also when they start to pair up. So when we get into February and March, we see adult males looking for adult females. Once they pair, they're generally paired for life unless something happens to one of the 2 mates. And then they begin to set up a territory. They're looking for good resources, so good food, good denning locations for a female. And often in Pennsylvania, a territory is about 10 square miles. So that's pretty large. So when we think about density of coyotes in Pennsylvania, they're not terribly dense. It's a large predator, has a large territory, even though sometimes we hear or we think they're around every tree and every corner. In reality, 10 square miles is pretty large, and they defend that pretty well. So as we move in to spring, after they have mated, about 60-day gestation period, and that female begins to look for a good denning location. And that can be a rock pile, that could be an excavated groundhog hole, or it could be under your shed. And oftentimes we see that in more populated areas. They take advantage of humans, and we'll talk about some of their adaptations with humans a little bit later. And they generally have anywhere from 1 to 6 or 7 pups, on average 3 to 4. And they're very good parents because what we see is those 2 adults will continually be feeding those young into the early summer, into the late summer. But what's interesting is sometimes they will allow other adults or subadults, non-breeding animals, related, usually they're young females that may be related, or they're just passing through to stay in that territory, but they're required to also help feed the young in that territory. So you may have as many as 3 or 4 other adults or subadults bringing food constantly. And this is important when we think about their survival and why they're so good at what they do, which is staying alive. So as we get into summertime, they are growing very quickly because of all this food coming back. The female will move them from den to den if she feels that they're threatened in any way, and she will already have dens picked out throughout that territory. And then as we head into fall, it can become very dangerous. Most of these young are already adult size. They can be very difficult to tell apart. And again, as we mentioned, some of these adult females are allowed to stay, or these juvenile females are allowed to stay in the territory, but most juvenile males are kicked out in the fall. And so this time of year, oftentimes we'll see coyotes on the move. And this is that time of the year when most coyotes are transitioning from place to place. Young are looking for mates, young are looking for territories, and just trying to stay out of the way so that they don't get attacked when they go into another animal's territory. But it's also coming into hunting season, so that's also a very dangerous time for coyotes. And we'll talk more about, again, some of their survival instincts as we go a little bit further. Now, they do cause some conflicts, but not as many as you might think. Oftentimes when we think of conflicts, we're thinking of agricultural conflicts, or we're thinking of livestock, especially things like calves, lambs, even sometimes adult sheep. And it certainly happens. But when we look at what happens in Pennsylvania, we always try to talk to producers and provide some solutions. And so a lot of folks are familiar with guard animals. So we have things like llamas, donkeys, and dogs. There's specific dog breeds that were bred just for this thing. But we also talk about fences and lights and loud noises, using buildings. And actually, they're starting to use drones to scare predators away from livestock. And we're starting to see that be very useful. But let's look at how much does this really happen in Pennsylvania. So when we look at coyote complaints in Pennsylvania, we saw a peak here in about 2017 with about 625 complaints total. But look at what over 2/3 of those complaints are. We're afraid of coyotes. So there are people that are just calling, emailing, saying, I saw a coyote, I heard a coyote, somebody else saw one and told me about it, and we're afraid of it. And this is really Pennsylvanians trying to get used to the idea of having coyotes around. And so the other thing that we can look at is total depredation. That's that gray line. And so we had a high of that in 2008 at about 250 depredations that were reported. This past year, we were down to about 15 or 20. And it is continuing to go down. And we're also seeing a decline in our overall complaints. So what is this telling us? Does this mean there's less coyotes on the landscape? It could be. We don't keep track of most species in Pennsylvania. There's only 4 species in Pennsylvania that we actually have any kind of an idea on how many are there at any one time. Can anybody guess which 4 they are? Bear is 1, deer is 2, elk is 1. We don't do trout, but that may be. And then the other big one is turkeys. And we spend a lot of time doing that, but we are managing 480 species. So 4 of 480, we actually know how many there are. It's not practical for us to actually get to the bottom of this. So this is one of what we call population indices that we use to try to track our population stable, increasing, decreasing, but it's just one. We like to have a lot, and we'll look at harvest and a few other things here. So there's one of 2 things going on. There are less coyotes causing less problems, or, and this is kind of the way I lean, Pennsylvanians are just getting used to living with coyotes. So we're having less complaints and we're having less depredations because people are trying to take better care of their livestock. So this is an interesting map, and if it's too small for you, I apologize. But what we see here are kind of our density of complaints. Now we have one real big outlier in Clearfield County, and I cannot explain that. My assumption is it's a mistake in the data because this is pretty rural. So it'd be hard to believe that there'd be that many complaints. But the other things kind of make sense. Look, we're around Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, a little bit around Harrisburg, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, and then a little bit up in Erie. So these are all the areas where we get most of our complaints. And that makes sense. And we'll talk about urban coyotes and why we're starting to see more complaints in these urban areas. We don't get a lot from most of the rural areas in Pennsylvania. And so when we think of urban coyotes, we truly mean urban. There's been a long-standing study in Chicago where they have collared coyotes and watched these animals move in and out of the city. They're using tunnels, subways, they're using green spaces, they're using these corridors along rivers, streams, and they're using abandoned lots, and almost no one ever sees them. It's amazing. And why are they doing so well in cities? There's plenty of food. So there's our trash, and that trash also attracts lots of rodents. Maybe not rodents we want, but the rodents that they want. And so they are able to adapt extremely well. Again, very important for us to remember why they're so good at surviving and thriving despite humans. But sometimes we do get coyotes that can attack. Most of the time when this happens, and it happens very rarely in Pennsylvania, it's generally a disease issue. So it's usually coyotes that are diseased, things like rabies, canine distemper, or it's coyotes that have been fed and are habituated to people. So they've lost that fear of people. And we know that happens. But again, it doesn't happen often. And this is kind of the things that we see up in the news. And most of the time, again, it's more of a disease issue. So I keep kind of mentioning survival. And again, this is, to me, one of the best pictures that I've ever seen taken. I certainly can't take credit for it. But there's three things I think will be here long after we're gone. I think cockroaches for sure. Pretty sure raccoons will still be here. And I think coyotes will as well. And this is just a great picture of what that looks like when we're dead and gone. Those coyotes will be doing just well. And it's interesting because we have tried to eradicate this animal as hard as we possibly could, more than any other species out there. Out in Western US, before we saw this big push, we were trapping, we were using tons of different poisons, we were using a variety of different shooting methods, shooting them out of airplanes, helicopters. We just tried everything and we had no luck. And the harder we tried to kill these animals, the better they did. And that's because they actually have some pretty unique survival strategies. One is when you remove coyotes from a territory, we see lots of immigration. And we saw that with that coyote from Ontario, just how far they will travel to get to new territories. It's estimated that over a quarter of the coyotes on the landscape at any one time are just in a transition, are just moving, looking for territories. So as we remove them, they're going to just fill right back in as quick as possible. And so we're opening it up and we're actually encouraging more transition. One thing that we used to do, and this is still a good idea, is when we get a coyote that is killing sheep, a habitual sheep or livestock killer, a lot of times people just want every coyote there dead. Kill them all as fast as you can. But what that does is it creates a suction to draw more in. Oftentimes, we'll encourage just trying to take care of that one specific animal, but keep that territory intact to help keep other coyotes that might also kill livestock out. So there's a variety of techniques we can use. But the other thing that happens is we see litter size increase as populations decrease, which is incredible. And we see juvenile survival increase as populations decrease. And part of that's because there's more resources available for those adults to continue to bring that into the area. So again, as we have tried to kill them, they have continued to expand and colonize new areas. In Pennsylvania, we are a good example. As soon as they started to come in, we had an open season, which remains today. You can shoot a coyote any day or night of the year. All you need is a hunting license. You don't need a fur taker's license. We have a liberal trapping season. And if you want to shoot one, you can shoot one with a high-powered rifle with infrared scope or night vision scope. And they continue to persist. There's a lot of species we couldn't do that for without actually decimating that species. So this is our total coyote harvest in Pennsylvania. Again, we saw kind of a high harvest of about 45,000 in 2017. And then we saw that decline to back to about our 2005 numbers of about 20,000. Now, harvest is tough as a population index because part of what goes into this are fur prices or hunting or trapping effort. So how hard are people actually trying to harvest? So those are other things we can look into. But again, it's just an interesting index that we can kind of keep an eye on. But that gives you an idea of just how many are harvested, and they continue to persist. And I put this picture up here because this is an incredible testament to their survival, to their grit, to their toughness. So this is from a story that started in Utah. There's a young couple traveling from Utah to California. And as soon as they got started, they were traveling overnight, they hit a coyote. They thought they just ran over. They didn't actually get out to look, and they kept driving, and they never checked. They got gas, they didn't look, and then finally they made it to California, and they finally thought, well, we probably ought to look to see if there was any damage. They open it up, and this is what they see. They peel these pieces back. This coyote leaps out and just runs away. And this has happened more than once, not quite as far, but it's happened on several occasions. So they're very tough animals. And again, that kind of adds to their overall survival. So there's a few things that we need to talk about living with coyotes because they're not going away. And we as humans need to be able to understand how to live with them successfully. So the first is really just not purposely feeding wildlife. And that's a tough one. If you're here, you love wildlife. I love wildlife. I love to see it. And a lot of our wildlife species aren't easy to see. And the easiest way is to put food out to attract them in. But what we see that causes is, again, this habituation to food, loss of fear of humans, and then we start to see real conflict with this species. Sometimes we're not doing it on purpose. Sometimes it's just incidental. We're putting food out for an outdoor cat, for dogs, free water, things like that. And that also will attract them in, or it'll attract their prey, which could be rodents, and then that'll in turn attract coyotes. Securing garbage is important. If we don't have a lot of bears in the southeast here, but up in the northeast, that is one thing they deal with all the time. So they have really learned how to secure their garbage, but coyotes take advantage of garbage as well. And they can get in and start to feed on the garbage and cause a huge mess. And then closing off access to different things. We talked about how sometimes they'll den under your sheds. And so we can put grading down around our sheds or fencing, which helps kind of keep them away from our homes. This goes back to that incidental, keeping bird feeders clean. If we see a lot of waste bird feed on the ground, it's attracting rodents and attracting predators, and that can cause issues. Now, this is one that I put it on here to make us aware, but it's not something that needs to be panicked about. Keeping pets on a leash. This is really the only thing that I think is worth mentioning is in January, February, March, if you're walking your dog, this is during that mating season. And in places where we have really highly dense coyote populations in urban areas where they have lost their fear of humans, sometimes they will come after a pet, usually a dog. This doesn't happen often. I haven't heard about it in Pennsylvania, but I have heard about it up in Ohio around the Cleveland area where they have a lot of urban coyotes. And so just certain times of the year, keep an eye on your pets, but don't let it make you panic. And keeping wildlife wild is important too. If we start to see them habituate to our homes, going out, scaring them away, banging pots and pans, spraying them with water, it seems silly, but it's actually really important for any species that's getting too comfortable or too close to where we live to put that fear back into them. Now, to me, this is the most important thing that we can talk about tonight. We've talked about coyotes. We've broken down some of those myths. And to me, coyotes are very important for Pennsylvania, even though they're fairly recently arrival. One thing that they do is they help fill a missing niche, and they don't do it perfectly. But when we lost our gray wolf, we lost one of those apex predators. And we know when we look at places like Yellowstone, when you return an apex predator, we see that ecosystem starting to come back into balance. We'll never have a perfect balance here in Pennsylvania, but as wildlife managers, that's one of the things we strive for by trying to keep populations stable. And the coyote comes in and helps fill that missing niche. And part of that is by being a very effective and efficient scavenger. It's actually one of the only scavengers that can eat bones. And when we see lots of bone chips in their scat, it's because they're eating a lot of those deer carcasses down to almost nothing. And that's important because we have a lot of dead deer on the landscape. And so they're very efficient at what they do. And they're also good at managing prey populations, some prey that really don't have any overarching predators. So when we think of some of what we call mesopredators, we're thinking of raccoons, we're thinking of opossums, skunks, things like that. There aren't very many predators out there, but coyotes are one of those predators. And again, they help keep some of those populations in balance. And of course, rodent populations is also important to keep in balance. When we talk about disease mitigation, things like Lyme's disease, there's good research out there to show that predators can play a very important role in stopping or slowing the spread of Lyme's disease. And we're even seeing research with CWDs, chronic wasting disease, which hasn't made its way that far down this way, but it's on its way, unfortunately, and moving through the deer herd. And predators can also play an important role in helping to slow the spread of diseases like that. So that's also where the importance of a coyote comes in. And the one thing that all predators do is keep prey populations healthy. It's one thing that we often forget about, but it's a real basic part of our ecology. Because if we remove predators, we see prey populations start to skyrocket, but then we see things like disease come in, overabundance, lots of conflict. And by having predators and having the coyote, they're helping to keep those prey populations healthy, get rid of anything that's wounded, anything that's sick, anything that's genetically deficient, to keep it a healthy population. So with that, our favorite coyote says that's all for tonight, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. And again, I serve you as your fur-bearer biologist. And if you ever have questions and you want to reach out to me, please give me a call. Please shoot me an email, and I'm happy to help in any way that I can. So thank you so much for your attention tonight.
Yeah. Thank you, Tom. That was awesome. We might have questions online, but let's take questions from the audience.
Yeah.
Do we have a microphone for that or no?
Go ahead, man. Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that is a tough one. So with Fox, I'm not very good at fox calling. But yeah, so they can make like a high-pitched barking noise oftentimes, and we'll hear that in the winter and into the spring. Coyotes have a little bit of a deeper call, but they also have that yip, like yip, 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 and you'll hear that mixed in with barks and howls, kind of what we heard earlier there tonight. So generally it's a deeper sound though. So when you hear that, you'll likely know it's a coyote. Yeah, good question. Anybody else have any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Said that they were like 33 to 34 pounds, but then later,
Yeah.
but like 60.
Yes. Yeah. So
Can you repeat?
yeah, absolutely. So the question was, when we talked about coyotes in general, the average was about 33 to 34 pounds. And then we started to talk about eastern coyotes, that subspecies. We saw eastern coyotes up to close to 60 pounds. So that's kind of the difference. When we lump western and easterns together, we kind of are still down around that 33, 34 pounds. But here in Pennsylvania with Easterns, we see a much larger size. Now that is on the high end, that close to 60 pounds. So we still see most coyotes somewhere in the upper 30s to low 40s on average here in Pennsylvania, but it is a slightly larger animal. So great question. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
So, when the parent coyotes stake out their territory and they raise their pups
Yes.
and then they kick the young males out,
Yes.
do the females have the opportunity to, like, what happens to that territory? Do the parents stay there, or do they, is it just sort of understood that the females will get that territory or when they pass on?
Yeah, good question. So the question was really when we talk about territories and then we have young and juveniles coming up, what happens with those juvenile females, especially when they are ready to mate and have their own territory? So if they're allowed to stay in the territory, it's still the alpha male and alpha female that will defend it, but they're the only breeding coyotes in that territory. And so those juveniles are allowed to stay, but usually only for one more year before they are finally kicked out or before they disperse. Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, what's the lifespan on average of a coyote? Here in Pennsylvania, it's around 3.5 years, which is fairly long-lived for most wildlife species, but because it is more of an apex predator per se, it does have a fairly long lifespan. Yeah, yeah. Yes, sir. Good question. Yeah. So the question was for turkeys, are coyotes their number one predator? And that's not what we're seeing. So right now, there's a great study right now going on with turkeys in Pennsylvania. And we're looking at especially nesting turkeys and then some juvenile survival. What is eating most of our turkeys? And we're actually finding it's not coyotes. What we're finding so far, and we really don't have a lot of that information yet, but at least anecdotally from what we're seeing, is great horned owls take a fair amount of turkeys, especially like like an adult off the nest, which is surprising. And then those juveniles, especially little turkeys, that first 5 to 6 weeks is critical. If they can make it past that to flight, that age of flight where they can get up off the ground, they survive much better. And they're open for everything, so they're pretty wide open. But coyotes certainly will take turkeys. There's no doubt about it. But when we look at diet studies, especially, turkeys are not a major part of their diet whatsoever, but I never say they don't take turkeys, they certainly will. So yeah, good question. Yes, ma'am. Boy, that's a good question. Yeah, the question was kind of where could I see a coyote, especially in this area? It's very difficult because they are primarily nocturnal, but this time of year is good. And as we get into kind of that mid to late winter is good because you're also seeing coyotes starting to set up territories and move quite a bit. I always say if you want to see a coyote, sometimes actually calling. And so you can actually, if you have a speaker, a wireless speaker, you can play different sounds. So like coyote hunters, if they want to try to harvest a coyote, they're playing different sounds. And if you get online, you'll be able to find quite a few different sounds that are good for calling in coyotes. And that may be your best chance at actually seeing one. Just select an area that's pretty wide open, like an open field, especially right in the evening or first thing in the morning. Middle of the day, it's unlikely. And of course, that'd be the best time to see one for our eyes. But if you can work on either end of the day when you still have a little bit of light, and then use your phone with like a Bluetooth speaker and try to get in an area where you think, around here it might be a little bit easier because you have some open fields. If you have somebody that would allow you to just kind of park somewhere quietly and play that, that would probably give you your best opportunity. It's hard to see them randomly because you just never know where they're at. And they have such a huge territory that it's hard to really pinpoint where they're at. The only other time that would be great is if you see pups. So then you're close to a den. And then a lot of like photographers will look for those opportunities where they can find a den and then they'll kind of stake out close to that. And the chances are good, especially as you get into kind of midsummer and those pups are starting to basically become unkempt and they're just like moving around around the den. That's a good time. And And I was just walking in with somebody that said their friend saw a pup that was not afraid of them. And that's part of it too. A lot of times in the summertime, you may see pups because they're just not, wise enough to be afraid. So yeah, good question.
Jim, how often do you see them at the Bentley Preserve?
I've only seen them a couple times, but I hear them a few times a year.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen them multiple times at the Bryn Co-ed Preserve, just driving down St. Matthews Road.
So I have a question on the Ontario map. Can you explain what the numbers were versus the yellow dots without numbers? Also, what were the blue numbers? So I'm just going to run back to that in our PowerPoint. And I can probably tell you what some of that is. The blue dots, I don't recall, but let's take a quick peek at that together. Okay. So we're going to move this. So the yellow dots, as we're counting down these yellow dots, it's likely we're counting down from the last time we saw it. That's what I can determine from this picture and based on what they told me. I don't know what the blue dots mean because we see at least three number 2s, a number 3, number 5. So, but that's a good question, Travis, and I'm sorry I don't have a good answer for you. That's something I would need to follow up with Ontario about because we didn't get a ton of information, but just enough to try to get out and track this. I'm going to answer Kevin's question quick. How do you think deer, CWD, and coyotes interface? Do coyotes contribute to spreading the prions? This is a good question. I actually asked our CWD biologist this, what she felt, because I had that same question. Maybe they make things worse. So prions that are part of CWD, or really the cause, they are spread through feces and through urine, especially. Chronic wasting disease. Thank you. For this particular disease, they stay on the landscape for a long time. And that's why it's such a terrible disease, because as soon as it's on the landscape, it's very hard to get off of the landscape. And so with coyotes, they're eating it, and then that could pass through their overall digestive system, come out in their scat, and be left. What I would say, Kevin, is that not all those prions are going to make it through their digestive system. So some of those will not, some of those will be captured. So even if they are eating some of it, a lot less will be coming out the other end. Now, they do disperse a long distance, so they could potentially take it into an area where it hasn't been. And there's a lot of active research on this right now, but at least some of the initial research showed that they are actually somewhat useful predators in trying to contain some of these diseases. So great question, Kevin. You are definitely thinking in the right direction here. Any other questions here that I can take before I jump on to another one? Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's a good question. So the question was, are they able to work together more as a pack than as individuals because of the genetics that come from wolves? I've heard that as well. I have not seen much research that's actually been specific to that. So I don't talk about it too much because for me, I like to have that hard research to go off of. I know there's been anecdotal evidence of that, so people seeing that, but I don't know. There just hasn't been enough research that I'm comfortable to say that that's the case. It very well could be. That's certainly something that could come from wolf genetics. So yeah, it's a good question, and I've heard that as well. Yeah. Yep. Anybody else? All right, I'm going to jump into Whitney. So Whitney said, I have seen a coyote with mange near my house. Can my dogs get it, and can I treat the coyote? Good question, Whitney. And so there's a couple questions here. Can my dogs get it? It's likely sarcoptic mange, and other canines can get it. And so dogs can pick it up. It's not really often the case that they do, unless they would be like in physical contact with that coyote. Even though, it's potentially on the landscape these parasites don't live for long off of a host. And so it's unlikely that your dog would get it unless, again, it might get in a tussle with a coyote. And can I treat the coyote? Unfortunately, we recommend not treating the coyote. So we did a research study on black bears in Pennsylvania. Black bears we see in Pennsylvania have more mange than a lot of other states. So we were actually treating bears because we actually capture and tag a lot of black bears in Pennsylvania, hundreds of black bears. And we would treat these animals, and we found that, one or even two treatments is not enough to actually kind of break that parasite load and allow that animal to come back. Most of the time, fox and coyotes, as long as it's not a severe case heading into winter, they're able to overcome it. But there are animals that don't. And so we'll see that with animals that are completely bare, or especially around their chest area or their back. They're not able to keep themselves warm enough. And so it can eventually succumb basically to hypothermia in the winter time. But we don't recommend trying to treat it because it's generally overall a waste of time and resources. So that's a great question though, Whitney. And I know that some of that has occurred with red fox, folks trying to treat red fox, and it can cause some other conflict issues. So Steve asked, do you track sightings? And do you want us to report locations? We have an active pack here in Lower Gwinnett, Montgomery County. If I butchered that, I apologize. So I always encourage folks, if you see something, especially if you've never seen it before, feel free to get in touch with me. We don't necessarily track sightings as far as have a huge database or keep a map of it, but it can be important for us to know, especially to let our local district game warden know in case there's other calls or conflicts that might come up about it. So we do try to let them know if there's something strange. So earlier we were talking about a potential bobcat sighting in the area. And so that's really worth noting, nothing to be afraid of, but it's good for us to know, especially if we're trying to track the spread of bobcats in Pennsylvania. And that's the same with coyotes or any other species. So I never discourage people. If you see something or you see something strange, just reach out. It's always better to say something than not. And even if it's not, very novel, we're still interested in talking to you and staying in touch. So feel free to do that. Let's see here. Jean asks, are there large populations of coyotes in state parks? So that's a good question. So again, when we talk about populations, we think about densities and we think about home ranges. So in state parks, we certainly have plenty of coyotes, but that doesn't mean they're chock full of coyotes. There likely is a breeding pair. There might be a family group there. And they certainly will take advantage of it, especially in areas of the state where there's not a lot of other good habitat. And the Southeast is one of those areas where we don't have huge, extensive woodlands or forest lands. And so we would certainly expect to see coyotes in state parks. Yeah. So, does anybody else have any other questions? And I'll just make sure real quickly that nobody else. Oh, there's a great question or statement that we didn't cover, and I'm glad it was brought up by Anonymous. Thank you, Anonymous. Upstate New York has many coy dogs. Is there any tracking of this? So we hear about coy dogs, which is this combination of a dog and a coyote. What's interesting is that same study that looked at the genetics to try to find out where did eastern coyotes come from, and we looked at these genetics from across the Northeast and found a lot of wolf genetics, found actually very, very few dog genetics. So we hear about the coy dog all the time, but in reality, that's not really the case. It can happen. It has happened before, but it happens very seldomly. So that's an important statement or question, and I'm really glad that was brought up because that was something that I missed. And again, it's one of those myths that we hear all the time, and it's important to kind of get to the bottom of. Anybody else? Okay, I'll turn it back over here.
Thank you, Tom. That was a really super interesting lecture. I learned a lot about coyotes. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight and all of you that joined on Zoom. I think there were a lot. I don't know how many, but a lot. So Go home, watch the Eagles and the Phillies and go Phils. Go Eagles.